most people have come in, so we're going to kick it off. So nice to meet you all. I am Mary Keogh. I'm the Director of Marketing here at CoLab Software. Today, joining us is one of our really amazing customers, Tyler Phillips from TPI Composites. We have Matt Lane, who's part of the CoLab team, and Tyler V, who is also part of the CoLab team. So just to kick us off, that's exactly the order I'd like to go in for the intros. So we're going to have Tyler P. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, your role at TPI Composites, and then maybe just a little bit of like your experience with DFM. Are you on the receiving side? Are you on the sending side? So just kind of give the listeners some context there. And then same thing for Matt Lane and then Tyler V. Awesome.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Tyler Phillips. I am the Director of Global Engineering here at TPI Composites. I have worked for TPI now for a total of 11 years. Been in the composites industry now for 20 years, actually. As far as, TPI Composites, we are manufacturer of wind turbine blades. So the big giant structures you see driving down the road, that's what we make. We make them globally, across the world, from Mexico, Turkey, India, and we supply to a lot of the biggest OEMs. My role here, as far as it relates to DFM, more on the evaluating and then communicating with the customer. We are a build to print manufacturer. And so we normally would receive a design, normally try to have as much upfront interaction as we can, but then we would then receive a design. We would spread that across our organizations and our different departments, have them do the reviews, and then provide feedback to the OEMs on what can help us make it better for them. And that's where CoLab has come in order to try to help us streamline all of the efforts. And so rather than spill all the beans right now, I'll stop there and let the introductions continue.
All right, I guess I'm up next in that case. Thanks, Tyler, for the intro there. So yeah, I'm Matthew Lane. I currently work at CoLab as a customer success manager with Tyler here, who we'll get to now in a few minutes. Relatively new to the team at CoLab. Previous to CoLab, I worked at Tesla as a technical program manager. So actually working in a department called New Product Introduction, where we effectively served as the node between design and manufacturing. So getting into the conversation of DFM as it relates to new product introduction, very near and dear to my heart, for sure. As I've spoken to Mary and Tyler in advance here, definitely more on the receiving end of I guess, what can go wrong if you don't do the DFM process or conversation kind of correctly from the start. There's a lot of different ways that we can do that, which we'll obviously discuss today. And I don't want to give away all the answers right away, but yeah, that's a bit of experience that I've got there. Mechanical engineering background, so yeah, that's it for me.
Thanks, Matt. So Tyler Vizak, also a customer success manager at CoLab, so helping customers like Tyler collaborate internally and with their suppliers on use cases like DFM. In my past, started off as a mechanical engineer in the aerospace industry. Spent some time working on the broader life cycle in the PLM world, and then most recently spent time in a contract manufacturer doing some work with customers. So as far as DFM goes, kind of have experienced all of it, both on the receiving and also on the giving side. So excited to talk through that with everyone today.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So a few housekeeping tips before we get started here. We would love to hear from you guys. I have some questions and prompts for Tyler, and Matt, but would really love to get your input. So please submit any questions in that little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will make sure we ask the panel those and prioritize your live feedback over my preconceived prompts. So the first one today that I wanted to discuss, and I know Matt Lane, I'm going to hand this off to you first, is what I love about Tyler V and Matt Lane is they have a lot of experience with the companies who use CoLab every day. and they have a lot of experience with the before and the after of DFM. So what I want to dive into right now is kind of that before side. So before using CoLab, how do you really see companies like quote unquote do DFM? Because like we've talked about, there's just so many definitions of it, so many ways of doing it. So just give us like a synopsis, both from your experience with companies who use CoLab, but also your time at Tesla and in your mechanical engineering background. Like, what does that mean? What does it mean to do DFM?
Yeah, it's a super broad term. And even as we kind of prepare for this call, like talking to Tyler V, I even learned something in that conversation, right? I think the idea that I think of when we talk about design for manufacturing is just how do we interact with the parts to make a finished product, right? So there's designing a component or a part for functional use within the final design of a product. But then, of course, there's figuring out how are people going to interact with it. And that's all it comes down to. So that can be making the part itself, which is maybe designed for manufacturing. It could be using the part in an assembly, which is where like my experience primarily comes in with my previous role in manufacturing. How are people going to interact with the parts, assemble it to the assembly? How do we test to make sure that it's operating correctly? All those things. Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've thought about and even picked up from even working here at CoLab is like there's such like a broad usage for the term, but ultimately it's thinking about like how do we ensure that the product can go from a single piece into a final product that works as part of an assembly, right? And how are people going to interact with it at that point?
So when you're like thinking about that, so you said a lot of the DFM is like thinking about how this part is going to interact with it. When you are like part of a team, so you're, part of that technical program management at Tesla, like how is that done? Like how do you guys actually figure out, is this done? Design engineers like come and talk to you? Like how does that work? And how have you seen it work with companies who use CoLab?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's different contexts, right? Different portions of the design for manufacturing conversation. So what I would do in my previous role in change management is effectively when a design engineer wants to introduce a new product to an existing production line, or if we're launching a new product, effectively what we're doing at that point is they come to us with a design that they've effectively prepared to their best ability to perform as intended via some technical specifications, and we have to come up with a plan to validate it in production, right? But of course, we have lessons learned from other products and other programs that can be shared. So we start asking conversations like big ones are how does a person or a robot interact with a part? How do you load it onto an assembly? How do we fasten it? Do we have tool clearance? Stuff like that. So the big thing that we focused on was design for assembly versus I know like Tyler V has some experience like working externally and talking about how to make the parts themselves, which is kind of a little bit different from my own experience. But and that's what we've seen even with some of the customers that I've been working with recently. But at the end of the day, again, it's figuring out how is the part going to go from being a design to actually existing in real life, right?
Nice. That's awesome. Tyler Phillips, how does that work on your end? So Matt talked a lot about how it works kind of like internally from an internal process standpoint, but you said you're kind of on the receiving end of that and you kind of interact with your customers on how they can do DFM. So like in your experience, both before they come into contact with you and TPI, and then after, as you're working through that process, like what does it look like? How do companies consider like doing DFM?
Well, it's prior to CoLab, it was Excel spreadsheets, to be honest. As a build to, like I said, as a build to print manufacturer, we would normally receive a set of drawings. We would send those out to a group of people around the globe. We would then populate a spreadsheet over, can we lay up the materials? Can we position them? Can we inspect once the product is made? How easy is it to repair it out in the field? How easy is it or can we meet the tolerances during the assembly? And so we would then provide the feedback to the OEMs and then work with them so that way they would understand what our concerns were and how they can adjust either the product tolerances, requirements, etc., in order to help us be more successful. And so it's really been it was a very manual process. Which spreadsheet do you have? Which revision of the documents do you have? Which server are things based off of? And so that's where we knowing that we were going into a more digital age with each one of our suppliers, we needed something that was slightly more robust and able to take global input at all at one time, and to really help the collaboration so that we weren't having to duplicate a lot of the information that we would around just a paper copy. So the collaboration with the customers from then to now is still a very manual process in order to try to work through each one of those line items, because not all want access to CoLab. It's somewhat of a new process for them, and so we still have to walk through each one of those items that we're requesting, and whether it be those inspection methods, the layup methods, understanding tolerances, expanding those, etc. So
yeah, that's super interesting. So do you have kind of an internal checklist? So like when you're working with an OEM, they're handing you off a design. Do you have your own checklist you're working through along with theirs, or how does that process work when you're checking off those items?
Really, it comes down to the experience of the individuals that we're asking to come into the design reviews. We've got a lot of people around the world with decades worth of experience that we try to leverage as much as possible. We are not we're not as fast as, say, an automotive industry or an aerospace from a changeover standpoint. We might go 12 to 18 months before we would do a changeover from a product standpoint. And so we don't have as many design reviews as frequently as some of the other folks.
Yeah, super interesting. Tyler V, from your perspective, you're working with a lot of customers, I think, on like our internal DFM. And one of my favorite quotes from you is like, DFM is probably too specific of a term. Like for most companies who think they're doing DFM, it should really be DFX. So can you kind of talk through what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of like the guys have stated, it's very broad, right? And it's very dependent on what industry you're in, what you're making, and what manufacturing processes make up that. So when we talk about DFM, really the goal is to identify as much risk as possible that's going to potentially occur downstream, and start to prepare and mitigate that upfront. So like when Tyler said, we have individuals with all of this expertise. The goal is to really get all of those folks together early and take advantage of that collective expertise in a way that gets around some of the challenges that they face today, which, like Tyler said, you may have a huge administrative burden managing a huge spreadsheet across multiple projects. You may have to try to wrangle someone who's got a lifetime of experience running this machine off the floor to come contribute expertise on your design. And that's hard to do, right? So that's really, in my mind, when we talk about DFM, what we're trying to do. And if we expand that to DFX, that doesn't just mean the folks running the manufacturing process. We also want to try to optimize for quality, right? Is our quality plan acceptable per our customer requirements, right? Can we actually run an inspection on the CMM and do it in a way in which we're not spending tons of money? Or do we have to wait 12 weeks for this custom gauge when we can do it a different way? So we're looking across all the downstream activities that include manufacturing, quality, MRO, logistics, sourcing, right? That all comes into play, and we want to bring those people in as early as possible.
Nice. That's awesome. I think that gives like a really nice broad overview of kind of the state of DFM today and how companies define and execute it. So I think that brings us into a really nice segue into our next question was, where do you see this process break down? So Matt Lane, just like starting with you, where do you really see that DFM process, both internally and what you've seen with customers who have to communicate and collaborate externally? How and where does that process break down?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think a lot of the time, like what I've seen from the design engineering perspective is they think a lot about how am I going to make the component that I have designed? And maybe even how is this going to integrate with the overall, in my experience, it's vehicle. So how am I going to fit it on the vehicle and how is it going to perform with the neighboring components, right? Which is great. That's great to understand like the integration perspective and even think about how is your part going to be manufactured so you can understand like the cost to manufacture something and just understand like the overall supply chain, right? But like Tyler kind of alluded to is like, how do we then think about the expertise we have in the assembly process once we actually receive the component ensure that it like can be assembled, interacted with by like an associate, a robot, whatever the case may be. And just think about how we basically design for that interaction, right? So yeah, I think the biggest thing is that like Tyler P talked about, is using the experience that you have on the team, like using the lessons learned from previous projects, from previous programs, bringing that all together. And that's what's hard. Like when we talk about like getting all the expertise in one room, you might have a global team that you have like different industry experts within different divisions, scattered across different time zones. And it's hard to get all that feedback in early to work on something. On the other end, we've actually executed some of that in some of the projects that I've been on. And you almost end up with the opposite problem where you have too much information. And now we have to filter out what's truly important, right? The quality team is super passionate about X, Y, or Z. Manufacturing cares about something else. And then the design team just wants to get this built so they can actually test it in production and understand what's going to go wrong. Because they also care about, does the part actually work, right? So we actually have to test this in functionality. So everyone's got different priorities, and depending on which part of the spectrum you fall on there, there's really just different challenges with that. Even if you get all the talent brought into the right place, which is hard enough as it is, and what we've seen with a lot of customers who do like VAVE events, like value analysis, value engineering, it's expensive to maybe fly people across the world to participate in like different like destructive teardowns of their assemblies, to talk about how to do it better. Even trying to sync up time zones to be in a virtual meeting and talk about the different design tasks we want to take on. It's really tough. It's a huge admin burden trying to track all the information coming out of that and make sure that all the feedback is actioned. Like all these things are what like creates the burden. And it's really hard to come out with a concise list of actions that the team can follow up on and understand that these are the 10 big hitters where if we cross these off our list, we're going to have like an A+ product. And then all these other things are like nice to haves for efficiency boosts later on. But that whole exercise is, I think, like really, really tough.
Nice. Yeah. Tyler Phillips, do you see kind of the same processes breaking down? I have a follow-up question from one of our attendees, but first I want to see like, where do you see that process breaking down as someone who's like on the receiving end of a lot of like DFM and designs?
Yeah, I think Matt hit the nail on the head. Whether it be customer priorities, whether it be internal priorities, everybody's got their list of action items and what has to bubble up to the top. In a lot of instances, I see where you have to take that top 20%, and then the rest kind of becomes the nice to haves, or can be some noise, and it then follows up after the fact, and as time goes on, things continue to fall off the list and can be harder to push as the product is being developed and you're continuing to get it further into production. And so no really additional comments to that.
Nice. That's awesome. Well, one of our attendees was really, you piqued his curiosity when you brought up this manual process of like spreadsheets, line items, specs, that kind of thing. And he said at a previous company, he had used 5 sources of information to improve the DFM process. And that was kind of doing product specs, then lessons learned, then a decision log, then safety and design. Have you seen that utilized? And if so, or if not, where do you see like as being on the receiving end of a lot of these designs? Where do you see that? Yes, like that sounds good, but in practice, it's actually much harder.
One of the things we've really tried to push over the last few years, I can't even remember if it's Toyota based, but the acronym TIMWOOD, right? You look at the time, the inventory, movement, waste, overproducing, overproduction, and delay times. It's one of the things that we've really, kind of pushed for people to think about as they review the DFM items. Normally what we would do from an engineering standpoint is look at the product and can we make the product. We may not necessarily pull in some of the safety stuff or all of the quality team at the time that we get the drawings. We do engage say from an experience standpoint, our lessons learned because of the wealth of knowledge that we do have around our organization, and some of those pain points that we've had to deal with over our history. So That's really the lessons learned. We've got a lessons learned database, and as you evolve, you start to pull these things together, and they become easier to do with some of the systems that we put in place. So to answer the question, yes and no, maybe not in a very specific, we've got this process and we've had it for 10 years. It's been, kind of handed down through the folks.
Yeah, nice. That's awesome. Tyler V, anything to add to Matt or Tyler's comments on how and where the DFM process breaks down?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can talk about it from an external manufacturing perspective. Oftentimes, at least in my experience, when we would work with a customer, right, they would come forth with a design definition, right? So a model and a drawing, maybe some specs, and we would quote that, right? But in my mind, success in DFM is much more than just delivering a part, right? They may be willing to make changes to that design to get the part much earlier, or they may be able to make changes to get the part cheaper, and those may be very important to them. So in order to, I guess, really capture the expertise of suppliers, you need to communicate in a way that's a little bit more fluid and open, in which you can kind of, I guess, explain what your success criteria is, right? And for production, obviously, that's going to be a lot more nailed down and specific. But if we're in prototyping or we're bridging to production, there's some flexibility, right, where we may be able to change stock sizes or use standard threads or whatever it might be to really make an impact on that customer's project. And too often I saw kind of just a straight communication, like give me a quote and we'll purchase it, versus that fluid discussion in which suppliers can actually offer expertise to their customers and make changes that are going to be dramatically beneficial for project schedule, cost, and quality. And this is exacerbated oftentimes when you have procurement separated from engineering. All of a sudden now you did all this internal engineering DFM, and then procurement takes it, and there's this gap between that internal team and the expertise at the supplier, and we start to lose the benefit of all that work that was originally done instead of gaining more from it. So I saw that a lot, and I think that's something, again, that ties into the theme here, which is keeping everyone together and keeping the feedback in one spot, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. I also worked at an OEM for a long time before I came to CoLab, and we saw the exact same thing. Like, we were really pushing for our customers to come to us earlier and offer some of that engineering feedback, some of that engineering expertise. But to your point, it was just like, give me the quote. What do you got? How much quantity? Where are the price breaks? So do you think, Tyler V, that happens because it's owned by procurement? So do you think just having engineering to engineering on both the customer side and the OEM side would solve that problem? Like, where do you think that issue lies?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of that is true, right? Sometimes you have procurement teams that maybe do not have the technical expertise that is in engineering. So they're very much dealing in terms of commercial stuff like cost, schedule, et cetera. But I think more often than not, it's a breakdown in communication between your supplier and customer. And I think that starts with just, again, changing the way you approach DFM, especially with external manufacturers, where we want to look at it more like a partnership. And we have to, I think, communicate in a way with those suppliers to invite them to kind of offer these suggestions, right? For example, a machining project, very common feedback that you'll get is if the tolerances are too tight and it's going to drastically affect the yield, that will oftentimes come back. But there are a lot of times, like I used to see notes on a drawing that would increase the sourcing time for the material by like 12 weeks. And I took it as fact. I'm like, there was never a question to me that wasn't a requirement, but I think there's a lot of flexibility, especially in the prototyping phase, is phases to have those open conversations with your suppliers to really make sure you're optimizing your project for what you care about, whether it's cost, schedule, quality, etc.
Nice. That's awesome. I love that. That actually brings us into our segue for our next prompt, which is a great one. Tyler Phillips, do you internally or do your customers measure DFM? Do they use any like metrics that they tie back to it? This doesn't necessarily have to tie directly into DFM, but it could be, hey, we want to reduce our BOM costs, stuff like that. Is there any short-term or long-term metrics they use to tie that back to design for manufacturability?
Other than the checkbox that says the DFM's been done, excuse me, we call it an engineering review. Yes, the engineering review has been completed. There really isn't a metric that I've seen from any of our OEMs and customers that are driving change.
Super interesting. Matt Lane, are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, I think ours is a little interesting. Like there's a few different metrics that you look at when kind of launching, like especially like a vehicle program, right? Like the certainly the metrics of like the final vehicle that you build, right? Like you want to make this thing as light as possible, as efficient as possible, so it has like the best range, for example, is always talked about with electric vehicles. So mass is a big thing. Also cost, because if you're in the business of manufacturing, like it can't be super expensive if you want someone to be able to pay a reasonable price to buy more, right? So those are definitely like some of the final metrics we look at from like an executive level. That's what people care about. What gets kind of interesting is like we see when working with like supply chain teams, if you're not bringing all your risk forward and you have a lot of rework, or you have to rush order parts because there was confusion between ordering from a prototype supplier, they got the wrong revision, and now we need to fix that communication. Like that's something else that happens often because you forgot to move a hole an inch to the right or whatever, right? Like rush ordering parts, like reworking, all this gets really expensive. So when you think about like the dollar value that gets tracked there, what's interesting is that like might not always roll up at the end during like the lessons learned to say like, here's what we did wrong, here's how we can do it better next time, because finance cares about this, but like maybe the design team like doesn't technically care about like the money spent in development, because to Tyler Reed's point is like when you're in those early phase design turns, like the prototyping phase, like all the metrics can be different. So it gets quite interesting. And even I'll say too, like on the manufacturing side, like what we track is again different, right? We have number of reworked parts, number of late parts, because we're trying to track when can we start building versus when parts are arriving. But all these can like add up to misses in our mind. And even when we're building, like how many are we reworking? How many are we creating like a JIRA ticket for, just to say there's a potential improvement? Like all these are like metrics that we track, but it's not just how you measure it, but like how do you resolve what you're tracking, right? That's like another big thing. And like driving that back to completion is like often quite hard because I think like, again, different industries might be different. I'm interested to hear from like Tyler Phillips in this case, but like with like the slower moving design churn in the different industries here, often what I've seen is like engineers finish with one project, they're straight on to another before they really pencils down on the first. So Tyler, like I don't know if that's the same from what you've seen with the different timelines and stuff, but
it does vary from product to product, customer to customer. In many instances there may be a revision change where there's kind of an upgrade. From a car perspective, it might be that that next level of performance, a little bit more horsepower, a little bit more speed, very similar in the wind industry, a little bit more power, a little bit catches the wind a little bit earlier. So you'll get some intermediate changes, but in a lot of times, yeah, they are normally on to the next project pretty quick.
Mary, I'm gonna add one more thing on the metric side. Something that we used to do, right? You'd have your as planned project, right? That's defined by your schedule, your cost, and the quality of the product that you're producing and its ability to meet the specs, right? And then you've got your production metrics associated to that, maybe yield, cycle times, throughput, etc. And that's all fine, right? That's what's planned. And I think oftentimes we looked at the result of DFM being the variation between that planned project and the actual results, right? So how much did cost change? How much did schedule get delayed? And that variation, I think, is very much a result of risk, right? Did you do a good job up front in your DFM or your DFX to identify the risk to keep that variation as small as possible? But the hardest part, and I think Matt and Tyler alluded to this, is like to actually measure the results of DFM on that is extremely challenging because most places don't even have that feedback consolidated in one spot to be able to say this resulted in this, this resulted in this, right? And that I think is one of the most important things when, you know, redesigning or designing a DFM program is to make sure, like one of our attendees said, like, can we consolidate this and not only drive it to conclusion, but feed it back into our process so we can make sure that this approach is repeatable, program after program, right?
Nice, that's awesome. So from what I'm hearing from a lot of you is there are really specific like downstream metrics that are easy to track for DFM, stuff like cost, time to production, rework, that kind of thing. And it doesn't sound like there's a lot of like early stage metrics that we can track to kind of say, yes, DFM is working, no, DFM isn't working. Here's how we can make it better. More importantly, here's how we can improve it. So when you're thinking about rethinking or redesigning a DFM program for a company, how do you think they can start tracking this kind of thing? Like, where would you start when you are either consulting or receiving DFM feedback? Where would you start on redesigning a DFM program? Matt Lane, I'll hand it off to you first.
It's a good question. I think I'd be a very rich man if I knew the exact answer to that. It's a tough one. I think it goes back to like what we talked about earlier, right? It's like there's like different companies and different teams have like a lot of different practices and different industries, right? Like we've got, you know, folks mentioned in the comments here, like there's different ways to bring in like lessons learned, stuff like that. I mean, you can like finish a project, launch like one vehicle, one whatever, one product, take all of your lessons learned, take a month off, right? Talk about what we did well and what we didn't do well. And you can take time to gather data, like what excess costs did we spend? What went well and what didn't? Implementing that back into a new project, I think is always going to be inherently quite tough. And I think that comes down to like two things, right? Is like, first of all, is like, how do we filter out the important stuff, which we already kind of talked about, because you're going to end up with just a ton of feedback, right? Like no project on earth has ever gone over perfectly the first time that I'm aware of. So, you know what I mean? It's quite a lot of information to take in, no matter what the project is. But also you have to think about like your resources, right? If you're like the top level, like project or program manager for a new whatever, and you want to take all the lessons learned from the old one, that's super great. But again, like filtering out what's the most important when you're also trying to make sure you have the right resources queued up to execute on supply chain, make sure that we have prototype vendors, make sure we have mass manufacturing vendors, which can be different, and like a thorough supply chain built for that, on top of all the design churn that's already going to happen as you enter new design stages for new projects, keeping in mind there's different prototyping stages to get down to your mass manufacturing kind of level, right? Like keeping in mind all of the things you already have to do to set up a new project with limited resource, because every company tries to run as lean as they can. It's just, I think, like a headcount burden at that point, maybe, where you can't do it all, right? Like no matter what, you are going to have boundary conditions. And if you think you don't, you're going to run into them organically if you're not even aware of them in the beginning, right? So I think that's what it gets to, is like determining like what's the most important considerations out the gate and then moving from there.
Nice.
I'd like to take a stab at that going.
Yes, please.
To add on to that. And so, you know, for TPI Composites, CoLab has really been our kind of our shift to redoing our engineering reviews, DFM. You know, as we continued to work, as we've continued to grow in our relationship with our customers, you know, there's always been the time to market. And so having to take a digital file and then turn that into all of the work or all of the drawings and the specifications, that takes time. And so in that collaboration, it's been, okay, how do we then time to market faster? and having a digital solution to be able to review, understand. A lot of the OEMs don't just use, say, SolidWorks or Rhino. It's a higher power CATIA based. And so CoLab has provided us the opportunity to be able to share the content coming from our OEMs so that our engineers around the world don't have to have, the specific license that is however much it is. And we can then review the drawing or review the files, understand them better, and not have to wait for the actual PDF to come through. And we can start to do that review and start to provide feedback. It's not a kind of over the fence mentality. And so that has helped us get to, better relationships, further upfront communication. And so it's helped kind of improve how soon in the design we are actually able to provide better feedback.
Mary, can I add one last thought? Because Tyler, I think,
yes, please do.
Got me spinning here. I think in at least a lot of places I work, and I think it's fairly prevalent in industry. I think we can all agree that, right, the costs during design are fairly inconsequential compared to the cost of the manufacturing system. And I think we can also agree that a lot of the choices we make during design lead to the bulk of the cost in the manufacturing system. But the question then becomes why is DFM still so hard to wrap our heads around? And I was at a conference recently, and everyone was talking about this throw it over this fence mentality between design, manufacturing, quality, and everyone was agreeing. And I'm like, why are we accepting that as how it has to be? So I think first and foremost, I think the change in culture around, who is responsible for this, and it very much is a life cycle responsibility, and it needs to be treated as such, right? It's hard to expect the designers to have all of the knowledge they need to make decisions that are going to be optimal for downstream activities. And the moment we bring in everyone else as you're also responsible to participate here, I think we can start getting into some of the details that, Matt and Tyler talked around process. But until we create this culture of the designers being willing and open to bring people in early that may potentially blow up their designs, but also bringing in these stakeholders with this expertise that a green engineer might not have, I think then we can start to tap into what really is going to make a successful DFM program, because everyone's committed to it as not just a checkbox, but this is the cost that we need to pay to be able to design successful, complicated products, right? And we can't do that without introducing a ton of risk, without doing DFM, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. I've also heard it, Jeremy Andrews, who's one of the co-founders here at CoLab, has also introduced this idea of maybe measuring engagement. So putting metrics around early engagement. So quality of that engagement, number of reviewers, who's coming in from what department. So that's also a really interesting metric to think about when you're rethinking this DFM process. Okay, so we've had a couple questions come in, kind of the same question. Tyler V, I'll pass this to you. What function do you often see getting most interested in CoLab early on? Is this supply chain sourcing, quality, R&D, manufacturing, who's getting involved, and how does that kind of spread throughout the company?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think oftentimes design is very much excited about using CoLab just because it creates this virtual collaboration room in which we can all collaborate around the design context, but we can bring in the right people when we need it. It allows them to operate faster and not get slowed down by waiting on feedback from some of these downstream experts, right? And if I'm a designer, all I cared about, did I meet my release date, right? I know that I should care about getting the right feedback that's going to avoid late stage change. but I really just want to meet my deadline that my boss has asked me about. So that, I think, gets people excited. But also, when we talk about these downstream stakeholders, a lot of times they don't have CAD. A lot of times they don't have an easy access to the data. So being able to come in earlier and ultimately have a seat at the table to help that designer make the right decisions that's going to make their life easier, I think is a no-brainer for a lot of these teams, and instantly gets them excited about CoLab.
That's awesome. Tyler Phillips, I'm going to kind of pass the same question along to you as kind of an external contributor here. So how have you seen, because I'm guessing you got excited early on because of the design aspect, but when you have introduced it to other teams or teams from your customers, who have you seen surprisingly get excited about stuff from CoLab?
We have we've limited our groups that we have come into CoLab. As the one of the CoLab administrators, I know that we are probably 97% all engineers. Only one or two different quality folks have come into it and then actually provided any feedback within the design reviews. So our engineers are primarily the ones that are interested in being able to see other people's comments and learn from that. So we haven't had as large of a influence over our different departments. As far as our customers have shown interest. Unfortunately, we had to work through some IT issues in order to make it happen, and the program moved faster than what we could get access. So yeah, it's been really the engineers that have been most interested in it.
Awesome. Madeline, anything to add there?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate most of what Tyler said, Tyler V. I think that, as a design engineer, your focus is getting it out the door. But one thing I've seen as well is there's a lot of different type of focus when you're a design engineer, right? You can try and, kick it out the door and just cross your fingers and hope nothing goes wrong and that nothing feeds back to your boss later. So, in this case, you've hit your deadline, but you haven't really accounted for what might go wrong. But bringing everything in earlier and being able to improve the collaboration is what enables you to make sure that when this product leaves the door, you've already accounted for the manufacturing, you've already accounted for potential quality issues, at least those that you could foresee, right? Bringing those things in early are what, again, the design engineers really like to see. And to Tyler's point, again, bringing in a quality engineer or even a contract manufacturer, it just enables them to have a voice early on. So just leveraging portals and stuff. We had a customer that was onboarded, and within 2 weeks they had already created portals with their quality team, and they've got hundreds of pieces of feedback generated across a couple dozen files, and they're feeling 10 steps ahead already for their next product launch. And they've only been using this for 3 weeks at this point, but it really goes to show when you give these folks a voice, everyone feels better because now they're feeding off of the collaborative kind of nature of things, and overall they're going to have a better product as a result. So it's really cool to see kind of live in action.
Nice. That's awesome. I have a longer question, but I think this will have a good brainstorm session between the three of you. So this person's at a company, automotive tier 1 supplier. They utilize lessons learned from a lot of their previous projects, along with technical experts' tribal knowledge to drive important topics into DFM/DFAs. They then document specific issues and reasons into a form that is reviewed by a specific department like purchasing, operations, R&D. And then this becomes their DFM or A standard. This also must be in production for a minimum of 6 months, quality free. This then ends up into a list of DFMs that must be applied during development. We check what is applicable at the beginning of the project in our stage 2 gate to kick off development. Then they do a second check of what was actually applied in design release to gate 3. The checks are manual. DFMs are all in Excel, and we would like to automate this if possible and build them into CAD to start models sooner. Mm-hmm. Do you see CoLab helping with this? Where do you see not only CoLab helping, but maybe just that DFM process in general? Where do you see it improving?
Yeah. So what I hear here is a fairly robust process, which I'm not surprised if it's an automotive supplier, which is great, right? Because then you have a standard and repeatable process that you follow. So the things that we can immediately start tapping into with CoLab is all of these gate reviews that you have can be done potentially asynchronously in CoLab versus the traditional method of trying to navigate all those schedules and get all those people in one room. And we can also keep that list of issues and checks that come up during those sessions together and consolidated in one spot. The next thing I'll say is, the DFM checks that you actually do will likely change at various steps in your gates, right? Early stages, the design isn't necessarily as mature, so you may have higher level DFM checks. As we go through, it's going to get more detail, but we can essentially templatize those checklists so that as you get to the associated gate, that checklist is already there. Everyone knows what we need to look at, and we can tie any issues to the checklist. And the last thing I'll comment is when you talk about tribal knowledge and lessons learned, if there's anything that comes up during this process that isn't already captured in the CoLab templatized checklist, there's ways we can really kind of tag things as like lessons learned or for continuous improvement, so that after or even during, we can have a retrospective and try to rebuild these into the checklist, right? So our process is growing and evolving with everything that we learn. So that's what comes to head immediately. But obviously this is fairly rigorous. So the process we could probably develop in partnership would be a little bit more intense than I can share in a minute.
Nice. Matt, this actually kind of got me thinking about the process when you were at Tesla, you said was also actually very rigorous. Like you had a team dedicated to DFM, but interestingly, you were also encouraged to kind of do DFM on your own during the NPD NPI process. Can you talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. Like specific to our process before, right? You have like the design phase where they'll do their independent DFM for manufacturing the component. And then when it comes to our change control, change management process for introduction to manufacturing, what we care about is different, right? So like, speaking to the question here, like implementing the tribal knowledge, it's almost less structured in that way because we have a lot of like manufacturing learnings and we're trying to basically bring in the cross-functional team that's downstream and bring all those learnings ahead. So even having a forum and trying to contribute to the cross-functional communication for people to be able to speak to those issues is what we were trying to do. And what we do then is like in that specific scenario, like we would have a call, kind of like what we're doing right now. We'd get our design engineer to present the change, and then everyone has the opportunity to ask questions. One thing that I really like about CoLab, and Tyler's touched on a couple of the tools we can use within CoLab. But when we just conduct the review and give people time within, a 7-day window to get in there, review the model on their own time and think about their own failure modes, it's much easier to kind of capture ideas. And also then, we talked about checklists. So if we're reviewing and we say something's failing, you can link that to a piece of feedback. So nothing's going kind of untracked, right? We have a lot of new issues being generated. Maybe we have ideas that come up after a call that don't get tracked. So in this case, it gives people that window to ensure they get all the ideas in. But also you just might, in a meeting where you're generating issues and try to simplify it that way, you might just run out of time, right? Like that's like such a big thing. But when you have this process of set up a review, add the correct people, track the feedback, and then like Tyler said, use the checklist, use the tags to track themes and lessons learned, it creates actually a more rigorous process, even though it's kind of simplified in that way. At least it feels simplified to us once you kind of get the habit down and create that culture shift. But it becomes truly more rigorous because it's much harder to miss things and it creates such a bigger impact in that way.
Nice. Tyler Phillips, do you want to wrap up anything that CoLab has helped you guys automate or really add some more robust processes on your end or your customers?
Yeah, maybe just to hit on the last question for the and somewhat of a sales pitch, right? not a CoLab employee. The tags, the process flows, the ability to tag, to now customize tags, set those in place, link information to questions. I know that's starting to evolve within TPI. So you can very easily start to feed that lessons learned, feed that tribal knowledge in. But it's culture. It is culture. You have to put the rigor into changing how you think. It's not just a spreadsheet. It's not on someone's desktop. It becomes the tool that you use in order to communicate. So I think for TPI, we still need to evolve through that and be better ourselves and to drive that culture in. And I think it could be very easily be fit into, any other industry. So, Mary, would you want to restate that second question for me?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So just knowing all of that, is there any other like processes that CoLab has made more robust for your team or your customers?
Recently what I've seen is where we've been able to take our DFM content, and when we've really reinforced how people provide the content, we're actually extracting it out of CoLab because we haven't gotten to the full portals yet. But with how much information we do get out of CoLab, our customers are now reaching out to the individual people, because we're having our teams put more information in from, what's the question, what's the ask, what's a potential solution, and they're coming back to the individual people with just a few people in copy, and we're able to move through things maybe a little bit faster than what we have before.
Nice. Love it. All right, guys, this is great. I'm going to wrap it up here. Tyler Phillips, thank you so much for coming on. Tyler V and Matt Lane, thank you for sharing your knowledge, both from your past lives as engineers and also from some of the companies you work with at CoLab. We will be sending out the recording of this in a wrap-up email, so don't worry there. You'll get all the access to this information, and it'll be live up on our YouTube channel next week. So thank you guys again. Really appreciate your time. Thanks everyone for participating and asking questions.
Thanks,
Thank
Mary.
you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.